It looked like a joke. Dean Martin lifted his glass. The audience expected laughter. But when the drink spilled onto Johnny Carson, no one laughed. Because this wasn't written. The studio lights were constant that night, just like every other night. NBC's Studio One in Burbank had seen thousands of tapings by then, each one following the invisible architecture of late-night television, the rhythm of setup, punchline, applause. Johnny Carson sat in his chair, legs crossed, pen tapping against his desk. Across from him, Dean Martin slouched with the ease of a man who'd spent 40 years making audiences believe he was always slightly drunk and never particularly concerned about anything. Dean held a glass. Amber liquid, probably meant to look like whiskey. It didn't matter what was actually in it. The prop was the point. For years, Dean Martin had built a character around that glass. The lovable lush, the crooner who couldn't quite walk a straight line, the Rat Pack icon who treated life like one long cocktail party. America had bought it completely. They loved him for it. Johnny Carson was the opposite in almost every way that mattered. Where Dean performed looseness, Johnny performed precision. Where Dean let jokes spill out messily, Johnny timed them to the microsecond. Johnny Carson didn't drink on camera. He didn't stumble. He didn't blur the line between the man and the performance. At least not in ways the audience could see. They had joked for years, but live television has rules, even for friends. The interview had started normally. Dean walked out to massive applause, that signature half-smile already in place, moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this 100 times before. He dropped into the guest chair with a theatrical sigh, the glass already in his hand before he sat down. The audience laughed. They always laughed at Dean. That was the contract. Johnny leaned forward, ready to play his part, the straight man, the enabler of chaos, the ringmaster who kept the circus from burning down while looking like he was barely trying. They developed a rhythm over the years, these two. Dean would push, Johnny would redirect. Dean would slur something outrageous. Johnny would make it land with a look. But something was different tonight. Not obviously. Not in a way that anyone watching from home could have named. Dean was telling a story about Frank Sinatra, something about Vegas and a misunderstanding with a showgirl. The audience was warm. Johnny was smiling. Everything was exactly as it should have been, except the glass was closer than usual. Dean had always used the drink as a prop, waving it around for emphasis, taking exaggerated sips at punchlines. It was part of the choreography. Johnny had learned long ago to lean back slightly when Dean got animated, to give him room to gesture. It was an unspoken adjustment, the kind of thing you learn after enough hours together on camera. But tonight, Dean wasn't just gesturing, he was leaning in. The glass moved through the air between them, with less precision than usual, less of the control that even the most committed character actor maintains. It swung wide during a laugh line. It tilted dangerously close to the edge of the desk during a pause. Johnny noticed. Of course he noticed. Johnny Carson noticed everything. That was how he'd survived 30 years of live television without a major disaster. He read rooms the way other people read books, and right now, the room was telling him that Dean Martin was somewhere he usually wasn't, not quite in control. The story continued. Frank had said something, Dean had responded, a misunderstanding had occurred. The audience was following along, but Johnny was watching the glass. It had moved from Dean's right hand to his left, then back again. The liquid inside caught the studio lights, refracting them in brief, sharp flashes. "So Frank looks at me," Dean was saying, his voice doing that lazy slide it did when he was deep in character, and he says, "Dino, if you're gonna insult her, at least get her name right." The audience laughed. Johnny smiled on cue. But his body language had shifted, subtle, imperceptible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. His shoulders had pulled back half an inch. His right hand, which had been resting casually on the desk, was now flat against the surface, fingers spread slightly, grounding himself. Dean raised the glass again, this time higher than before. He was still talking, the story spinning out into some ridiculous conclusion about mistaken identity and a coat check girl, but the glass had become the focal point of the scene. It hovered in the air between them, amber liquid tilting toward the rim. "And I told him," Dean continued, his eyes bright with the kind of mischief that could either be scripted or genuine. "I said, 'Frank, I never get the names right. That's why they love me. Another laugh from the audience. But it was thinner this time. Uncertain. Because the glass was still raised, and Dean hadn't lowered it, and there was something in the air now that felt less like comedy and more like the moment before something breaks. Johnny didn't flinch. That was the warning. Most people lean back when something comes toward them. It's instinct. But Johnny Carson had spent 3 decades training himself out of instinct, replacing it with something more useful: control. He could sit through a joke bombing and not show it on his face. He could interview someone he despised and make them feel like the most fascinating person in the world. He could take a piece of terrible news 30 seconds before airtime and still hit his mark with perfect timing. So when the glass moved closer, when Dean's hand tilted just slightly, when the liquid inside began its slow journey toward the rim, Johnny didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his eyes on Dean's face, his expression neutral, his body language communicating nothing except a complete absence of concern. But the absence itself was the message. Dean must have seen it. He'd known Johnny long enough to read the signs. The smile was still there, but behind it, something else was calculating. Dean Martin wasn't actually drunk. He never was, not really, not during work. But he'd played the drunk so long that sometimes the line between performance and reality became difficult to locate, even for him. The glass tilted further. "You know what your problem is, John?" Dean said, his voice still light, still joking, but with an edge now that cut through the laughter. "You're too careful. You never take risks." It was meant to sound playful. It came out as something else. The audience didn't know whether to laugh or not. The silence stretched for half a beat too long, that dangerous gap where live television can tip from entertainment into something uncomfortably real. Johnny's expression didn't change. "That's why I'm still here, Dean." It was a perfect line, delivered perfectly. The kind of comeback that should have gotten applause, should have reset the rhythm, should have pulled them back from whatever edge they were approaching. But Dean didn't laugh. Instead, he lifted the glass higher, and for a moment, just a fraction of a second, it was genuinely unclear what he was going to do. The studio audience had gone quiet now, not with anticipation but with confusion. This wasn't following the script. This wasn't following any script. And then Dean Martin poured his drink on Johnny Carson. Not quickly, not with violence, almost gently, really. The liquid left the glass in a slow, deliberate stream, arcing through the air under the hot studio lights, catching every camera angle on its way down. It landed on Johnny's shoulder first, then spread across his jacket, darkening the fabric in an expanding stain. For half a second, live television stopped being entertainment. No one laughed. The audience didn't know if they were allowed to. The band didn't play. Even Ed McMahon, sitting off to the side where the second guest usually waited, had frozen mid-gesture. The cameramen kept filming because that's what cameramen do, but you could almost feel their uncertainty through the lens. Johnny Carson sat perfectly still. He didn't stand up. He didn't brush at the liquid soaking into his jacket. He didn't make a joke. He didn't smile. He simply sat there, looking at Dean Martin with an expression that communicated absolutely nothing and therefore communicated everything. The drink dripped from his shoulder onto the desk. A small pool formed near the edge, threatening to spill over onto the carpet. No one moved to clean it. The moment had paralyzed the entire studio. Dean lowered the empty glass slowly. He was still smiling, but it wasn't the easy, performative smile he'd walked out with. This was something more complicated. There was uncertainty in it now, and beneath that, the first stirrings of realization that he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "I'm just kidding, Pally," Dean said, his voice quieter than before. The word Pally hung in the air, trying to pull them back to familiar territory, to the well-worn groove of their public friendship. Johnny still didn't move. The silence expanded. That calm wasn't forgiveness. It was control. This was the thing about Johnny Carson that most people never understood. The quick wit, the perfect timing, the effortless charm, those were skills, certainly, but they weren't the foundation. The foundation was control. Johnny Carson had built his entire career on the ability to maintain absolute control over every element of his show, every variable in the complex equation of live television. And Dean Martin had just introduced chaos. Not the planned chaos of a surprise guest or a bit that went slightly wrong. Real chaos. The kind that couldn't be edited out or laughed away. The kind that exposed the machinery behind the magic, the tension behind the smiles, the very real possibility that these men who joked together for the cameras might not actually like each other very much at all. Johnny's hand moved finally, reaching slowly for the napkin that sat beside his coffee mug. He picked it up with deliberate care and dabbed at his shoulder, his movements precise and controlled. He didn't look at Dean while he did this. He looked at the napkin, watching it darken as it absorbed the liquid. The audience watched. America watched. Dean Martin watched. "We'll be right back," Johnny said finally, his voice perfectly level, perfectly professional, perfectly empty of anything that might reveal what he was actually thinking. Doc Severinsen, the bandleader, caught the cue immediately and launched into the commercial break music. The red lights on the cameras blinked off. The spell broke, but only technically. Dean Martin knew something had shifted, not the show, the relationship. As soon as they cut to commercial, the studio filled with the kind of movement that happens when people don't know what else to do. Stagehands appeared from nowhere with towels. A production assistant materialized beside Johnny's desk with a replacement jacket. The makeup artist rushed forward to check for damage that might show on camera. But Johnny waved them all away. He stood up slowly, still holding the damp napkin, and looked at Dean Martin. Really looked at him, in a way he hadn't during the entire exchange. Dean, for his part, had set down the empty glass and was standing too, his hands hanging loose at his sides in a posture that was neither defensive nor apologetic, just waiting. They didn't speak, not during the commercial break, not in the 2 minutes and 30 seconds that should have been filled with the usual off-camera banter, the readjustment of energy, the brief dropping of masks that happened in the spaces between performance. Ed McMahon watched from his chair, his face carefully neutral. He'd been with Johnny long enough to know when to intervene and when to stay completely still. This was a stay still moment. The crew moved around them with exaggerated casualness, everyone pretending not to notice the tension, everyone completely aware of it. In television studios, silence is unusual. There's always sound, equipment humming, people talking, music playing. But in that commercial break, Studio One became genuinely quiet, and in that quiet, you could hear something that usually remained hidden. The cost of performance, the weight of always being on, the exhaustion of men who'd spent so many years being public versions of themselves that the private versions had become theoretical. Dean Martin had built a career on appearing not to care. But standing there in the silence, the empty glass still in his peripheral vision, he cared very much whether Johnny Carson would forgive him. Not because of the show would go on, it always did, but because in that moment of genuine transgression, the performance had cracked and something real had leaked through. And real things have consequences. The floor director counted down from 10. The cameras prepared to go live again. Johnny Carson had changed his jacket. The replacement fit perfectly, kept on hand for exactly these kinds of emergencies, and had returned to his seat. His hair was still perfect. His posture was still relaxed. When the red light came back on, his smile would be exactly as warm and welcoming as it had been before the commercial break. But Dean Martin, settling back into the guest chair, could see what the cameras wouldn't catch. The minute adjustment in Johnny's body language, the way he'd angled himself slightly away, creating an extra inch of distance that hadn't been there before. The absence of the small, conspiratorial smile that Johnny usually gave his guests during commercial breaks, the one that said, "We're in this together." "And we're back," Johnny said as the cameras went live again, his voice carrying no trace of what had just happened. "Dean Martin is here, and we were talking about Frank Sinatra's remarkable ability to hold a grudge." It was a perfect pivot, professional, smooth, giving Dean an easy topic to riff on, a clear path back to the comfortable rhythm of the show. Dean took it. Of course he did. He was a professional too. He launched into another story, this one safer, more clearly rehearsed. The audience laughed in the right places. The interview continued for another 8 minutes, hitting all the beats it was supposed to hit. The upcoming album, the recent movie, the anecdote that promoted the Vegas show without sounding like an advertisement. They shook hands when Dean's segment ended. Johnny stood up for him, which he didn't always do. The audience gave Dean a standing ovation as he walked off stage. Everything looked exactly as it should have looked. But that was the thing about television. It showed you what it wanted you to see. And what it wanted you to see that night was two old friends having a good time, sharing stories, trading jokes. What it didn't show you was the moment after Dean disappeared behind the curtain, when Johnny sat back down at his desk and his smile dropped for exactly 2 seconds. Not long enough to be caught on camera during the transition to the next guest, but long enough for Ed McMahon to notice. Ed didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. The show continued. The next guest came out. Johnny was brilliant with them, as he always was. By the time the closing credits rolled, the incident with Dean Martin had been buried under 30 more minutes of professional entertainment, wrapped up and packaged and ready to be forgotten. Except it wasn't forgotten. In the green room afterward, Dean Martin waited. He'd removed his jacket and was sitting in one of the uncomfortable chairs that NBC provided, smoking a cigarette even though he was trying to quit. Other guests filtered in and out, congratulating each other on their segments, making plans for dinner. Dean stayed where he was. He was waiting for Johnny. They'd done this hundreds of times before. The post-show decompression, the moment when the performers became people again, when they could talk honestly about what had worked and what hadn't. It was a ritual, and Dean Martin was enough of a traditionalist to believe that rituals mattered. But Johnny didn't come. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The green room gradually emptied. A production assistant poked her head in to tell Dean that his car was waiting. Dean nodded, stubbed out his cigarette, and stood up. Johnny Carson had already left, gone home through the private exit he used when he didn't want to talk to anyone, the exit that bypassed the green room entirely. Dean stood there for a moment, jacket over his arm, understanding settling in. This was the real consequence. Not a fight, not angry words, just the quiet removal of access, the subtle but unmistakable closing of a door. Some jokes disappear when the lights go off. Others stay, because they shouldn't have happened. Over the following weeks, Dean Martin appeared on other shows. He told the story of the spilled drink on himself once or twice, framing it as a hilarious mishap, a moment of spontaneous television gold. Some interviewers laughed. Others sensed there was more to it but didn't push. Johnny Carson never mentioned it, not on air, not in interviews. When asked about Dean Martin in later years, he spoke warmly about him, professionally about him, but with a careful distance that people who knew them both recognized as significant. They worked together again, of course. Show business is small, and both men were too successful to avoid each other entirely. But it was different after that night. More formal, more careful. The easy assumption of friendship had been replaced with the polite collaboration of colleagues. In Dean Martin's version of events, when he told the story years later in his own autobiography, the incident became a funny anecdote about the unpredictability of live television. He described Johnny laughing it off, both of them joking about it afterward. It was a good story. People enjoyed it. But people who were actually there, who stood in Studio One that night and felt the temperature drop, who watched Johnny Carson's face go blank with control, who witnessed the silence that followed, those people knew a different version. They knew that what looked like a joke wasn't a joke at all. It was a test, or maybe a challenge, or maybe just the inevitable moment when someone who'd spent too long performing being careless finally became actually careless and discovered that the friend he'd taken for granted was less forgiving than the character that friend played on television. Television is magic, but it's not miraculous. It can show you a moment, but it can't show you what the moment meant. It can capture the spill of liquid under studio lights, the surprised silence of an audience, the professional recovery of two men who knew how to put on a show. What it can't capture is the moment later, in the privacy of a dressing room, when Johnny Carson hung up his replacement jacket and allowed himself to feel what he hadn't let himself feel on camera. Anger, maybe, or disappointment. Or just the tired recognition that even friendships performed for millions of people can end, not with drama, but with the quiet decision to stop pretending that performance equals reality. Dean Martin went home that night believing he'd gotten away with it. The show had continued. The audience had eventually laughed. Johnny had been professional. From a certain angle, it all looked fine. But Johnny Carson went home knowing something Dean would take years to fully understand. That respect, once damaged, doesn't repair itself just because you keep smiling. That the permission to cross boundaries isn't the same as the right to ignore them. That live television is unforgiving, not because of what it shows, but because of what it captures. The truth in the space between the performance. Years later, when Johnny Carson did his final show, Dean Martin wasn't there. There were legitimate reasons. Dean's health, scheduling conflicts, the simple logistics of a massive television event. The absence made sense. But people who remembered that night in Studio One, who'd watched a drink spill and a silence grow, understood that the absence had started much earlier. It had started the moment Johnny Carson decided that some things, once broken, don't deserve to be fixed. The glass had been emptied, the stage had been cleared, the show had gone on. But the friendship, in any real sense, had ended the moment Dean Martin chose to test whether the rules applied to him, and Johnny Carson, with his perfect control and his unforgiving memory, had quietly answered, yes, they do. Even for friends, especially for friends.